Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. K, and we're talking about the Northwest Rebellion in this episode. So we'll just get right into it if that's okay with you.
That's okay with me.
That's okay with you? Okay, that's good. So now that Mac's back in town and the railroad's in progress, was the West ready for settlement?
Was the West ready for settlement? Well, we talked about the treaties, and I think we established that that had all been kind of settled by the late 1870s. The last thing that happens, though, in the Canadian West before it's kind of open for settlement and safe is the Northwest Rebellion. So the Northwest Rebellion, the last kind of big thing that happens. And it's not really clear cut, why, well, I suppose we know why the rebellion takes place. Well, I'll tell you why the rebellion takes place later on. But there are quite a few different perspectives on it. And you have, first of all, that it's the first in a long line of Western Canadian grievances, so just kind of tying it to the West specifically. Another perspective is that this is the last stand of the Métis, so this is the last Métis insurrection against a negligent government. And the third one is that it occurs because of government indifference. So Mac might be back in town, but he's got a lot of other things to worry about. He's going to be working on the railway. He's coming in just as Treaty 8's been signed. And when he looks to the West, he looks to it in terms of how can I get my railway out there without any trouble? And where might the trouble come from? And he always thinks the trouble might come from Native people, so from First Nations rather than the Métis who, they'd already been dealt with in 1870. And the fourth perspective on the Northwest Rebellions is that it's all has to do with the delusions of a madman, that madman being our old friend Louis Riel. So lots of different perspectives on the Northwest Rebellion, and it is the last big thing of any note to happen before the West is, so we say West open for settlement from, what group? Well, obviously Europeans that are being brought over and sent over there. So there's there's lots of really good books on the Northwest Rebellion, but three really good perspectives if you were a student and you wanted to kind of see what the broad spectrum was of responses from historians. So Bob Beale and Rod McLeod, their book Prairie Fire, just excellent, beautifully written, talks about all three groups in the West. So looks at Native people, looks at the Métis, and looks at the Canadian settlers who are out there. So that's a really good one. They kind of argue that the Northwest Rebellion is a little bit of everything, that it's not just one thing. Then there's Thomas Flanagan from the U of C, who's really a political scientist but has written extensively on Riel, and he really blames the Métis and lets the government off the hook, They're thinking, well, the Métis start petitioning the government in 1878, don't get response till 1884. That's just a slight delay, to him, not government ignoring them. And then there's the book by Sprague, which is about the 1869 and the 1885 rebellion, and the blame there. If Sprague picked out one person to blame, it would be, I think, Macdonald. That Macdonald actually isn't unhappy when the rebellion breaks out because he's facing all those problems that we talked about before with getting more funding, and the guys coming back again and again saying we need more money to finish the railway. And so Sprague, in a sense, kind of says, well, Macdonald's in a bit of a bind. He's having trouble with the backbenchers. If there happened to be an outbreak of violence in the West, the train would look like a really good thing. And so maybe that's why he doesn't respond. And he gets what he wants. He gets the funding for the railway at the same time as the rebellion takes place. So there is that little line of causation between the two. There's also a really good book by Blair Stonechild called Loyal to the Death, talking about Native people and their response to the Northwest Rebellion, because Canadian historians tended to, for a long time, lump Native people and Métis people together and just assume that everybody, was going up and everything was going up in flames and everybody was upset about everything. And the fact is that a lot of groups out west who had just signed the numbered treaties treaties knew that if they broke the peace part of the treaty, the whole treaty would be cast in doubt, and it was bad enough the deal that they'd got without losing it completely. So that one, loyal to the deaths, very, very good. And then my old friend Donald Smith at the U of C, the man that gave me a start in Canadian history, he's written a lot of books, but a recent one called Honoré Jackson, and it's about Will Jackson, who was the settler representative that worked closely with Louis Riel, and so his story, and he's like right at the heart of the story. So there's lots and lots of really good accounts, and then there's a cartoon account of the rebellion. There's all sorts of really good things. So it's definitely the last outbreak of violence in the West, and it's definitely something that John A Macdonald has to deal with before he can kind of say, yeah, the West's a safe place to go, off you go, and just kind of leave people alone out there. So there's actually 3 groups involved in the Northwest Rebellion.
So not just the Métis.
No, not just the Métis. So and that's another thing that people have maybe the wrong impression about too. They think, well, it's all about Louis Riel, it's all about the Métis, and it's all about Riel going around different reserves trying to get native chiefs, or trying to get the chiefs of the mostly Cree chiefs to join him. So seeing it as a native thing that has nothing to do with the settlers that are already out there at places like Prince Albert. And this, of course, is kind of wrong, because when people do go in a delegation to approach Louis Riel and ask him to come back up and help them, to do what? To send a petition to the government to get them the same kind of deal that he had successfully made for them in 1870. It's not just Métis that go, it's this delegation that's representing the settlers and the Métis, and then to a much lesser extent, Native people are involved. Although oddly enough, they suffer, I think, the most at the end in terms of hangings and being put in jail, because the Lieutenant Governor sees this as a good opportunity to kind of quieten them, so get rid of any of the troublemakers. So they are involved, but we tend to, we as historians, I suppose, in the past have tended to push together some of the things that were happening, say in Big Bear's camp, and just kind of, because it's in the same year, attach it immediately to the Northwest Rebellion, when in fact it's a separate thing that could have been dealt with separately. So you've got the 3 groups that are involved. The new settlers are upset with the government because, remember, the train route was supposed to go high, and now it's been changed to the low route, and so there's to be no railway for the Yellowhead route. So men in the northern part of the Northwest Territories became disenchanted with the Conservative Party, so not happy about that. It was going to cost them a lot to ship their grain now, and many of them believed that Edgar Dewdney, who was Lieutenant Governor by the 80s, had a financial interest in the route change, and there's a lot of resentment towards him. And it turns out that they were right, because he had actually bought the land beside what would become the Regina station, so he was there to make quite a bit of money. But this young man, William Jackson, later renames himself Honoré Jackson, Jaxon, instead of the regular William Jackson. He's able to mobilize this disenchantment into support for Louis Riel and into support for the Métis population at large. So you've got that one group. And then the second group would be, I think, the Plains Cree, and the 3 key leaders there are Big Bear, Pie Pot, and Little Pine. And by the early 1880s, they were already trying to have the treaties renegotiated, and had tried to actually reach the government and say, this isn't working for us, it's not good at all, we'd like the whole thing reopened. And of course, it's just like with Confederation, the last thing you want to do if you think you've got it all sorted out is to reopen it. So the 3 chiefs in particular, Big Bear is probably the best known of all of them. They were more than aware that the government hadn't lived up to its treaty promises by this early stage, and as well they were upset that the farm instructors that were sent in to help with the transition to farming had very little experience. And in some cases, some of them had come directly from Scotland or England to Toronto, and now they're sent out west to this place that just doesn't seem suited for farming at all, and they've like no experience, and they're the ones that are supposed to be helping with the transition to farming. So that doesn't work out well. They're virtually useless. And there is some trouble between the farm instructors and in some cases the Indian agents and the native community, because they were, it seemed, withholding food. And then there's the whole issue of women favors and food, and that never goes down well in any community. So problems with that too. And to stop Big Bear in particular from causing trouble, Edgar Dewdney began rounding up people that he identified as troublemakers, including Big Bear. So and as I said a minute ago, although they're sometimes dragged into this and many times kept out of it completely, there are more of them who suffer at the end of the rebellion, because it's taken by an opportunity by people like Dewdney to just kind of, sort out the books, get rid of the troublemakers. And so lots of them resisted the Métis attempts to involve them. We just weren't happy about becoming involved at all. But it's used to settle old scores, I think, between at least Dewdney. The government may not have known that Dewdney was as hardline as he was, but Hugh Dempsey has a really good article called The Starvation Diaries of Edgar Dewdney, which is a really quite good read and shows you what position they're in. And then the third community, of course, were the Métis, and the oldest Métis settlement isn't the one that rises up. The oldest Métis settlement is at St. Albert in the 1870s, early 1870s. They don't really experience much unrest at all. The problem comes with the Métis who had been pushed out or who had moved out from Manitoba after the Manitoba Act, after the 1869-1870 rebellion. So they're so three groups, not one group.
And why were the Métis particularly affected? And were these the same Métis who had been at Red River in the last rebellion?
Yeah, many of the families were from there. And I think the problem had been that although the Manitoba Act had given 1.4 million acres or 160 acres of land per family, and it seemed generous, the reality was quite different for people. In fact, the first premier of Manitoba made it clear that they couldn't get title to the land that they were on. So they might be able to get title in the area, but it wasn't going to be where they actually were, and where a lot of them had been since the Battle of Seven Oaks had been there since the early 1800s, maybe 1816. So now the chances were that they were going to be moved off to the kind of fringes. So they had to move to the less sustainable parts of Red River. And besides that, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this before or not, but besides that, the Métis in Manitoba had to apply to the Hudson Bay Company for title deeds to the land that they wanted, get the title claim to it. And once they had the title based on their dealings with the Hudson Bay Company, then that had to go to the Dominion government in Ottawa, and they had to get title from the feds. And to show that to get the title from the federal government, they had to show that they had improved the land, and that was a very kind of specific sort of thing. Most Red River Métis used their land for hay, and that didn't fall under improvement. So if you hadn't made your little piece of land into a kind of European style farm, then after all that other bother, you still couldn't claim title to it. And then you have to remember that a lot of the Métis at Red River were illiterate as well. So this whole thing is like a 2.5-year process. In the meantime, people are coming in from Ontario and kind of claim jumping, or saying, I'll give you $100 for your piece of paper when you get it, your land script when you get it. So, the entire process had been far beyond what a lot of families thought they could manage. So a lot of people just kind of left the area and started to move west. And that's never a good idea, because you're having enough trouble settling or setting a claim to the land that you've been on for a long time. How much harder is that going to be when you just move into another area and then you can't even say, well, we've been here for generations? Mm-hmm. So it is a direct response to the difficulty that comes out of the Manitoba Act, and the fact that they don't really get the land that they need at all. But they come out anyway. You have, I think in the early 1870s, there's about 40 families that come out and they resettle on the banks of the mighty South Saskatchewan River, and they establish the village of Saint Laurent. I like my French, Saint Laurent. And within a few years,
Très bien.
they had land on both sides of the river for about 80 kilometres. And so they just put it out in the same old seigneurial system that we talked about, these long rectangular lots, because that's the best way to deal with a little river going through your area. Their commercial centre was at Batoche, and to the north, of course, you had Prince Albert, and there were Canadian settlers out there, or Ontario settlers, and some English-speaking Métis there as well. And the great worry that they had was that they might lose this land too, that, you know, at some point in the future they might lose this. They farmed there as well, as they had at Red River, but they're never totally dependent on farming because they followed the buffalo, and so they had the official buffalo hunt and the captain of the hunt, and the whole society kind of organized around the hunt. So they still relied on the buffalo hunt, and they found themselves, of course, farther out west competing with local bands, local native people who, as we know from last time, were having intense amount of difficulties finding any buffalo. And so now you've got the Métis moving into that area and participating as well. So in the 1870s, when the treaty signing started to begin out west, this particular group of Métis began to petition the government. They petitioned the lieutenant governor and the treaty commissioners, and they asked for land grants quite sensibly. They're like, okay, let's get this thing sorted out if there's any trouble. And there's no response from the council, and little response from the federal government either. And that, again, is because for Macdonald, he saw the threat coming perhaps from people like Big Bear and not from this small Métis community. And so in 1878, the trouble really kicks off when government surveyors arrive in the West without any warning, and they arrive at Saint Laurent. And we know for a fact that this is what kicked off the trouble in 1869 at Red River. Suddenly, government surveyors appear. They start surveying in the square English town lot, seeming to be trampling over people's rights. And so for the Métis, then, this is a moment of panic. You go, 1878, oh my God, the same thing that happened to us at Red River is going to happen here. And their first response is to appeal to the lieutenant governor and to petition the government directly. And their second response was to find Louis Riel. They're like, where is our leader? What's he up to? Maybe he can come back and he can do the same thing for us that he did so well for us the first time. So they start then in 1878 sending petitions to the government. And the government doesn't respond for like 6 years. So that causes even more panic.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we'll find out in part 2 of this episode.
If there is panic.
If there is panic, and what the government eventually did do.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll see you there.
Bye.